Boots first, then corset. If you're a corset wearer, you already know this to be true. If you intend to start wearing corsets, this is some of the best fashion advice you'll ever receive. Gentlemen, if your lady develops an interest in corsets, pass this wisdom on to her. It saves time and conflict. Corsets are a popular fashion choice among many subcultures and sometimes even in pop culture. Personally, I've been interested in corsetry for 3 years and bought my first one 2 years ago. Come to find out it's more of a rib top than a corset, but we'll discuss the difference later. Even if you don't want to wear one though, corsets have an interesting history. How they were used originally versus how they're used today is a fascinating example of how society and the ideals of beauty have changed over time. So my name is Maya Banks, and today I would like to tell you about the history of corsets, how they changed over time, why they're worn today, and then for those of you who either know a lady who wants to get into corsetry or you yourself want to get into it, I'd like to warn you about the common mistakes of first-time corset buyers. I'm going to start by explaining their history. Valerie Steele and Colleen Gall, the authors of a 2005 article called Corset from the Encyclopedia of Clothing and Fashion, state that corsets have been around in Western cultures for about 400 years. Originally, they were undergarments rather than overgarments, and were shaped like an inverted cone rather than an hourglass. Drea Lead, who writes for ElizabethanCostume.net, says that the cone shape was designed to mold the torso into a cylindrical shape and to flatten and raise the bust line. They were a mark of high social standing. You did not see peasant women with cylindrical torsos. In the Victorian era, the familiar hourglass shape came about and added some discomfort due to the fact it increased pressure on the rib cage and on the digestive tract. Victorian women wore their corsets tight-laced, which should not be done unless your body's used to it. Now that you're a little familiar with the corsets of past centuries, let's talk about today's corsets. Today they're a whole lot different. They have nothing to do with social class, they don't have to be tight-laced, and they don't have to be uncomfortable. Wearing a corset under your blouse or over it is a matter of personal choice. You have the choice to wear them for fashion or for waist training, which are the top 2 reasons why women wear them today. Fashion corsets are typically more decorative than waist training corsets and often have latches or zippers rather than busks to close them. They don't have to be tight-laced. The laces can just be pulled tight enough to ensure the modesty panel is in place and no further if that's what the wearer prefers. And the modesty panel, by the way, is this panel right here that makes sure they can't see your shirt through your corset. Fashion corsets are solely for looks. They're comfortable to wear when sized correctly, and although they do make an hourglass shape, they don't cinch the waist any smaller than the natural waistline. Waist training corsets, on the other hand, serve a slightly different function. They can be decorative, but they usually come in plain colors, and they can be worn either over the blouse or under it, doesn't matter. Rather than just look pretty though, they're actually used to trim down the wearer's waist slowly. I learned from Lucy of Lucy's Corsetry that there are safe ways to do this, but it takes baby steps. You can't tight lace a waist training corset immediately because it can hurt you if your body isn't used to it. You have to tighten it little bits at a time. Some very minor effects could be nausea or dizziness, something I learned the hard way from lacing a corset too tight. When done correctly, waist training can successfully take you from a 28-inch waist down to a 24-inch waist, and even down to a 22-inch. But you shouldn't go any smaller than 6 inches because that's not safe. That wraps up basic usage and construction of corsets, so now let's talk about mistakes first-time buyers tend to make. There are 3 major mistakes I want to warn you about. The first issue is that many first-time buyers have a hard time finding the correct size. The rule of thumb for choosing the right size is to measure just above your waist, right on top of your floating ribs, and subtract 4 inches from your measurements, and that will be your corset size. For example, I have a 28-inch waist, so my corset size is 24. Some sources say buy 6 sizes down, but that is not wise for beginners. The second thing is choosing the corset best suited for your purposes. You have to ask yourself why you're buying a corset. Do you want it for fashion, or do you want to waist train? Your answer determines what sort of corset you should look for. Waist training corsets are usually marked as such. They can be worn for fashion if you want to, but the reverse is not true, just due to structure. Several of my corsets are actually waist training corsets, but I wear them for fashion rather than get a tiny waist. the difference between the two is pretty much in how tight you pull your laces. If you lace only as tight as necessary for your modesty panel to be in place, you're not waist training. If you pull them tighter, you're starting to waist train. So all that said, you need to know what you want in a corset and shop accordingly. And the last thing is that corsets and rib tops are not the same thing, though they're usually marketed as the same thing. A corset will have 12 to 24 steel bones, making it sturdy and difficult to warp. A rib top may have fewer bones, and the bones will be made of plastic or rope, the former of which will often melt or warp after wearing it once. As mentioned earlier, my first corset was actually a rib top, and I only wore it once before the plastic bone was poking out of its casing and the bones were all warped a little bit. But real corsets won't give you that kind of problem. Rib tops are fairly easy to identify even if you're shopping online, just by checking out what the bones are made of. Essentially, if it's not steel, it's not real. In conclusion, corsets are not rocket science, but there are things you need to be aware of before you buy one. And now you understand a brief history of them, how their original uses are different from modern uses, and a few key things to be aware of when buying your first corset. Now perhaps you'll want to go home and delve more into the history yourselves, maybe shop for a corset, or in the gentleman's cases, help your significant other shop for one if she's shown interest. Or maybe not, but in any case, you've learned a bit more about the world of corsetry today. Thank you all for coming. I hope you have a wonderful evening.